very much, guys. Really, so, Steve, come on up. Great, thank you.
We're delighted to be with all of you tonight. And this series, this class, and this topic is near and dear to my heart. What I want to do with you here is kind of step back a little bit, look at this whole resilience concept from a more macro level, and then zero in around energy resilience. And then we'll turn to Maria to talk about how it gets really applied here to Northeastern, but I'm going to share kind of a pet project that I'm hoping that Northeastern might embrace here as well, in spirit of just what you saw here from MSU. So let me get started. I got thinking about resilience as something critical to how we need to be thinking about what we increasingly call the lifeline infrastructures, these things that we depend upon for certainly the quality of life, but basically it's the same modern life. By looking at this place, can anybody tell me what you're seeing, where this picture, what this is a picture of, a photo of? Yeah.
An airport?
It is an airport, but I'm trying to ask what specific airport it is. There is an airport. Anybody? I'm asking you to do a little bit, take what's going on down in the right side of the lower right. So that is, maybe down the lights a little bit. Let's see if it's better. Anybody see what's going on down there? Can't see to figure the lights out. That is a port. That is a container terminal. So that should help you think about it's not in the middle of the country. And running directly adjacent to the runways is actually a major highway. And adjacent to the highway is a railhead that brings much supplies. And what you're looking at here is on the left is Liberty International Airport in Newark. Okay, the Jersey Pike. The rail line again in Port Elizabeth, which is the largest container terminal on the East Coast. Brilliantly designed by putting it all in one place. So you can move that colorful boxes that you see on the ships or in the back of a tractor trailer on a train, that 40 by 8 by 8 box. You can move it from a ship to a train to a truck or any other version thereof, cargo onto the plane. I was looking at this through the 90s through a lens of the security challenge. If you're thinking about an adversary who wanted to cause mischief, does this look like a pretty potential interesting place to think about causing mischief? Because you can imagine in that space of just a little over a mile, you essentially not just only cause disruption to this transportation hub and Metro New York, but this turns out really to be the neck that feeds New England as well, okay, for rail and for most containerized cargo and other kinds of things. So I started looking at this saying, look, engineers are wonderful in thinking about efficiency and designing things for efficiency. But in that, you can also introduce an element of fragility. If you don't think about things like redundancies or being able to have, what if it's disrupted? What's the fallback plan? And so, and the kinds of impacts of this are, Manhattan actually has only about 24 hours of food at any given time. About 24 hours. Real estate is really expensive in Manhattan. And so big warehouses, they're all turned into those nice lofts now that people are spending quadrillion dollars living in and so forth here. The wharfs, they're all built up now. There's, maybe you have a cruise ship coming in and out, but there's none of that going on anymore in Manhattan because real estate is really valuable. But we live in a just-in-time world, so who cares? We'll just truck that stuff in. And so if you're in Manhattan at night, it sounds kind of noisy. It's not just the trash being picked up. It's basically the resupply of virtually all of the shelves, because not only New Yorkers, but people outside New York, like locusts, descend on the city each day, right, and consume what they have and go home. And all that is fed by this amazing transportation logistics system that, in the case of Metro New York, is concentrated actually in Newark, not in New York City, not in New York State. So this is, again, where I started thinking about, we probably mean not just for potential mischief, like a terrorist, right, causing potential disruption, which of course became a reality 20 years ago with 9/11, but also because of Mother Nature is pretty mischievous from time to time, and she could cause the same kind of disruption. So we have to start thinking about these lifeline infrastructures, not through just the lens of reliability, low cost, efficiency, but thinking about it in terms of, well, how well will they handle shocks and disruptions? And that's something that has sort of animated my work in a sense. Look, what we have as a definition of resilience that's operating today at the US government level is one that we've embraced at the Global Resilience Institute here at Northeastern. It's one I had a little hand in, and it's actually survived from the Obama administration through the Trump administration through back to the Biden administration, which is really miraculous if you study American politics right now. Okay. But the key element here is resilience is not just about an idea of bouncing back or recovering. Resilience as the concept has evolved borrowing from a number of disciplines, really contains this attribute of resilience against what and how. So it's the capacity to be prepared to withstand up to a point. And we've designed a structure to basically withstand the ground moving. That's a resilient structure, all right, if it doesn't fail. So there's the stuff you have to do up front to mitigate the risk, be prepared for it. But then when you actually have a shock or disruption that overwhelms those mitigation measures, then you want to be able to nimbly respond, ideally contain the disruption. And when you build back, you should adapt, right? You should build back better and smarter. I mean, if it failed as a result of what happened, just putting back together again doesn't make a lot of sense. That actually is how Americans have largely dealt with post-disasters, is we just put it back together. You know, Humpty Dumpty, we falls off the wall, we patch them back up again, put them back on the wall. And it falls down again with the next storm and go through this over and over again. And the idea here, though, is we really should get smarter. That's how evolution has worked. And think about how we adapt. So these are the key concepts. What I argue is animating the resilience imperative, why it's something really we should put front and center of our thinking right now, is not just the prevalence of hazards and threats. There certainly are more of them with climate. As we just heard, you know, they have more intensity, they're more frequent. But the issue is really this phenomenon. We are hyper-connected. And what that translates into is that what used to be a localized shock now disrupts in far more cascading and costly ways. Just going back to my Liberty Airport example there, you know, so you have a hurricane hits an airport. What's the, you know, we got a lot of airports. Well, no, it's also the rail, and it's also the trucks, and it's also the shipping. And oh, by the way, we get just-in-time deliveries. That's what's qualitatively different, is we're in a hyper-connected world. And so when you disrupt these major systems, the cost is getting really expensive. Pre-COVID, the World Bank was saying, well, we're running at about close to $500 billion a year by disruption. Maybe we want to get out in front of this. And so this is what's animating also the cost-benefit analysis of thinking about embedding more resilience. And then we're adding to this here now, of course, love the Internet of Things. And this is a relatively recent phenomenon, okay? You know, half your lifetime for some of you in this room here, but, you know, 2007, virtually none of that. There was virtually no connection between the physical world we're operating in, the infrastructure systems, and the net. You know, we had things so like electrical mechanical systems that basically took care of stuff. There used to be basically linemen who would walk out and look at things and check them in, you know, checklists. But we said, hey, we get more efficiency, right, by putting all these sensors together, have them talk to each other and line them on the net and all that. And it's exploded. Now we have our telephone talking to our refrigerator, talking to our toaster, talking to our dryer, telling our clothes are all set. Ooh, cool. Unless you disrupt it. Now the impact is all those functions are all tied to it, right? So we keep adding on more connectivity. We keep adding on this goal for more efficiency. And what we're doing is potentially elevating our fragility at the same time if we're not thinking about how to make these critical systems more resilient. So it's captured here well. We're talking about energy resilience today, but energy is never separate. You know, just a great point raised here, kind of basic. And all the stuff requires energy to operate. So that's kind of foundational. But this is captured pretty well by about 10 years ago. Everything has become connected. And the challenge here is that while electric power up in the upper right, well, you know, we need power for transportation systems. T is an electromechanical system, so it needs power to run it. And if you have transit, then you can't have essential workers get to places like hospitals And then the hospitals, of course, themselves are depending on HVAC systems and power and the rest here, so it can affect those. And oil and gas pipelines basically move gas in long pipelines, and they have compressor stations that push that gas up and down. And those often rely on power as well. In fact, we've taken a lot of the fossil fuel infrastructure to put it on electricity as a way to reduce its carbon footprint. Pretty smart from that sustainability perspective, but now has some fragility issues. Because we used to have a sort of big backup generator that used the dirty fuel that was the refinery was operating on. Now when the power goes out, it can no longer refine. So these are some of the issues, the trade-offs and tensions, but it comes from this issue of being hyper-connected and interdependent. And we have to think about these things, not in the isolated silos of each of the sectors or each of the functions they have, but how they are integrated and interrelated. So as a compare and contrast, it turns out that the largest natural disaster in US history for loss of life happened 100 plus years, 121 years ago now. On the 9th of September, 1900, no warning back then because there weren't any satellites, watching those hurricanes roll into the Caribbean. The place about Galveston, Texas. There's basically a big community built up there. And the storm pushed water out of the Gulf in a storm surge that basically, with the highest point in Galveston Island then was 8 feet. The guesstimates are that the storm surge was somewhere around 15 feet. And so it's like basically a tidal wave coming across the island. And the estimates are 8,000 dead. That's pretty high for a natural disaster, right, in US history context here. But the reality is, while it took out every house virtually was damaged, right, and that loss of life, for the rest of the nation, they didn't even know about it for about 24 hours. Because one of the things they also knocked out was a telegraph line. So it was a horrific disaster if you were in Galveston. You do not want to be in Galveston on September 9th, 1900. But if you're virtually anywhere else in the rest of the country, it was a non-event. Right? The loss of life is an issue that would directly impact those folks there, but it didn't impact the broader economy in any meaningful way. And take the case, though, of Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria. Again, taking that sort of interdependency. Hurricanes hitting Puerto Rico have happened all the time. Right? I mean, it goes back a long, long time. Right there in the Caribbean, hurricanes like to come through the Caribbean, and darn, a bunch of them will hit Puerto Rico from time to time. Why was Maria particularly devastating for Puerto Rico? It wasn't just that it was borderline Category 4. Sort of direct hit on the southwest east corner of Puerto Rico, moved across the island. It was every lifeline system that we rely on in modern life failed. All of them. The power went down. All the telecommunication systems were down because the cell towers went down. There was no fuel. To basically ran out of the backup fuel for backup generators. That ran out very shortly, and there was no resupply because there were no trucks. The port was disrupted. There were no trucks to come to the port to pick up things even when you got stuff in the port. The water, basic element of life, that needed power. That was shut down. So you had no water. You had no fuel. You had no telecommunication. You had no mobility or transportation. Pretty tough. And most of these places were basically literally, went back, 500 years of kind of quality of life here because all these systems failed concurrently. And so it wasn't just somebody throwing a switch and everything back on again, right? When you have that much disruption and that much cascades, it becomes a much bigger deal. And already now, happily, Puerto Rico is starting to think about, that big mainframe, basically power generation on the South Coast and all distribution lines off of rather hilly areas. And maybe we should think about microgrids. I mean, a bunch of these villages, they have like a lot of sun in Puerto Rico. And when it's not hurricanes, radical thing, they have sun there. They also have wind, breezes, and tropical and all that stuff here. Sustainable energy would probably be pretty good. And we're not talking a lot of demand for power in many of these small villages, right? So you could start to think about it. You could have a sustainable power generation efficiency that could be tied to a bigger grid, but then island itself, when the storms come in, and provide support for that community in the same way you saw it being applied to a college. That's a smarter way to go than just rebuild the big old mainframe power thing and try to rerun all those long distance transmission lines and put it all back together again. But it takes some planning to kind of get there. All right, some examples shared here, I guess animated, the work there on MSU. Something I get very familiar with Superstorm Sandy. I had a major grant from the Sloan Foundation to look at lessons learned through the lens of resilience and looking at the critical infrastructure sectors of energy, transportation, and health, which were all interconnected. First, I step off here. I had Superstorm Sandy, a little lost here. He was basically, I called it a predictive surprise. It was actually right at, this happens all the time with natural disasters. You'll hear like the mayors, governors go, oh no, there would be a hurricane coming here. You know, that's why we, you know, it's really hard. And yeah, who knew hurricanes might hit New York? Okay. These are track lines that basically go back to 1850. You know, hurricanes hitting New York are happily not as frequent an event as it is in the Outer Banks in North Carolina or in Southern Florida, but they are not like, you know, never happened kind of thing and, you know, blown out blue. So here's the wealthiest city in the world. You know, a lower frequency of storm, but turned out not all that prepared for a hurricane that was predictable. And what is also is predictable is the forces that a hurricane generates and what it will impact on lifeline systems. We could forecast this out. Things like storm surge, well, what will it hit? And what will the impact if you lose those things? And what's the cost of that? And who will be vulnerable? And what steps do we take to address that? None of that planning was done pre-Sandy hitting New York City. Emergency plans for, you know, the general stuff, we're going to get water, shelter, subway, but for what these systems have. And so here's a couple of stories I want to share with you. It did get a lot of attention. The grid went down, right? And not just in Metro, not just New York. It was all of Long Island, most of Connecticut, most of New Jersey, basically in chunks of Pennsylvania, all right? Entire region basically went dark for a good chunk of time. You know, over 1 million customers, outages, 30,000 assets, 50 distribution centers, 2,100 transformers, 900 miles of distribution lines knocked down. That's a lot of broken stuff. It's going to take you a while to fix that. But it turns out this was not the really serious energy problem that the Metro New York area faced with Superstorm Sandy. What it really was, okay, and this is actually captures the story of interdependency on a very micro scale. What's the guy in the green sweatpants doing? He's not pumping gas. What's he doing? Now, he's standing there in front of that filling station. How is he going to get that gas to come out of that pump into his red can? Yes. He needs his credit card, right? Yeah. So you have the telecommunications. Turns out they don't just give it away. So you need to have the power to actually run the telecommunications because people don't have lots of cash coming around. And so even at the most basic level, right, you see interdependency here, but this drew a lot of attention. But here was what the problem was. So basically, this is how fossil fuels end up into our economy. We're hoping we're going to fix some of this stuff here, right? But basically, everything from the middle of this screen to the right failed as a result of Superstorm Sandy. So basically, you know, you identify, you explore, you design and construct, you produce, and then you push out crude oil into the system here, and then you refine it, and then you start distributing it down the food chain so it ultimately gets to that gas station. Everything on the middle basically went disrupted here because what happened here was the port brings in 60+% of all the refined fuels for the Metro New York area. And guess what we did after the Superstorm Sandy? Closed the port, right? Because there was lots of debris and wreckage and so forth. So 65% taken off the table. All right, 20% of that was actually being refined by 3 refineries, 2 in Port Newark, 1 in Philadelphia. The 2 in Newark are beat up. They were knocked down. The 1 in Philadelphia shut itself down preemptively, which is a good move to do, but needed 3 days to come back up the line. And the last 15% was from the Colonial Pipeline that goes all the way down to Houston. It lost power in central Jersey, so the compressor station went out and it had damage at the other end here. So all of the liquid fuels, how much is that? It's the Metro New York area uses about 3.9 million gallons of fuel every day. So again, we got to work on. every single day. That whole system failed. And yet it was not understood and mapped out, you know, in a serious way. I'm sorry, it was 39 million gallons. I underestimated by tenfold. That's how much fuel is going through that system. Okay, now let's bring us into Boston and start thinking about energy here. So Boston, if Sandy hit Boston, it would have been much worse. All right, just make you feel all good. And it's really captured, the story here is captured very well by this image here. Okay, so the orange is what the Pilgrims saw when they showed up and what the Native Americans here, who were in the first place here, were living around. You can see Boston, Roxbury, okay, is that little spit that comes up here that connected the hill here, and that was Boston. Almost an island with just this little thin, basically, land bridge that took it to Roxbury. Right? You look across the way where you see East Boston and to the north Cambridge. So what happened here is the founding fathers of Boston said, we need more space. So how do you get space? You bring a lot of stuff in, you whack down some hills, you push stuff out, and you bring a lot of other stuff in and you build up. You fill in all those wetlands, you fill in all here. And you, a lot of that? No, I do just enough to get above high tide. Okay, now we got new space we're gonna put on it. Well, we're going industrial. So guess where we put virtually all the industrial landscape for our modern society? We didn't put it on Beacon Hill, right? Those are nice houses. They get pretty much are gonna stay dry no matter what happens with climate change in terms of flooding. But we put most of the industrial landscape basically down. Oh, this is actually captured my other one here. I get it that 42 million gallons. I lost my number here. Okay, so that was that one here. All right, so let's take, guess where we put our power infrastructure? The blue you're seeing here is if we had 8 feet of storm surge, okay? Now, in the case of Sandy, it was about 11 feet of storm surge in Lower Manhattan. So this isn't the worst case scenario. This is 8 feet. This tells you basically where the water is going to go. Now, it doesn't tell us exactly how the water is going to play or how deep it's going to be, but you layer on all of, in this case here, the generating stations, the electric substations, the gas facilities, all of their areas are basically in flood zones. Okay, all of them. Then we add the transit system. We put all that in flood zones too. And then I can zero in on something, electrical, mechanical system. Remember I talked about the T being electrical, mechanical? We put the power farm very conveniently on the waterfront. So the power goes out. This is in South Boston in the Seaport area, okay? If the power goes out, you basically get the major, and hey, it's got backup power, 2 jet turbine engines co-located on the facility. So you can imagine the storm surge coming in, taking out basically the transit's impact on transit, impact on the Mystic power plant, the LNG, by the way, it's, you know, the power plant's driven by liquefied natural gas, it has to be shipped in, your port's disrupted. Unlike the Sandy story, there is no pipeline bringing fuel into Metro Boston. There is no refineries in New England. All there is fuel that's shipped by ships that relies on the port to work. So we need to be thinking, right, about how we make ourselves more resilient, given that this is a predictive surprise. We don't know exact timing, but it will happen, and the consequences could be huge. So as we start to think about how we think about greater resilience in the energy sector, what I emphasize here are these 3 things. I'm going to be wrapping it up here. We need to prioritize meeting the energy requirements of all of the lifeline infrastructures. We have to identify those up front. And it's not that they all have to be operating 100% of the time. This is actually a challenge we have with the power industry. They define reliability as like 100%. I mean, you know, we're producing all the time. You're going to be reliable all the time. You should always have lights. And if you have less than that, well, we screwed up. It's not reliable. When you think about resilience, it's actually about having what you need is essential power, and then there's normal power. Essential power is the power you need to actually regenerate, recover from the event. And it's the power that goes to the other key elements of your lifeline systems that people depend on. So we can think about, of course, hospitals and, you know, telecommunications and so forth here. That's not 100%. If I have 10% power and it's going to the right places, I can actually do reasonably well in getting myself back up. I have 0 power, I'm like Puerto Rico did, I'm in real trouble. So, but we also got to think about some of us are more self-sufficient than others because we're well off. We have a second home, or we have other things that know how to happen. there are many parts of our population who are far more vulnerable, that don't have cars, that don't have the means to even get somewhere and put themselves in a hotel and so forth here. So clearly we need to be focusing on ensuring that the energy we have is serving those who are most vulnerable. And so we should be mapping those out, right? It's not just the big customers, or it's not just, health and so forth. It's who, if they lose power, would it be most disruptive to their lives, and would it be most costly for them? That should be a part of our thinking about resilience. We need to invest in emergency power systems and critical facility systems, ensure they have basically access to fuel over an extended period of time. Most of these have limited days. Most of these scenarios are multi-weeks, not just days. And so you can get by a little bit of time. The nightmare scenario in hurricanes is one that basically the hurricane just decides. We had a little bit of flavor of it here just recently with, Irene coming into New Orleans and ended up really stalking the middle of the country. But the real nasty one is it hits Florida, and then it hits the Outer Banks, and then it hits Jersey, and it's New York, and we're Boston left last on the list. Who's going to come to our help? Okay, right? They're going to starting to respond to all the other places. Then it's going to be like, hello, and it's going to be crickets. Okay, there's nobody going to be there coming to us because there is no extra capacity left over. It's already dealing with the impacts on the other major coastal cities. Now, we haven't had that kind of a storm here in a while, but that is, a perfectly feasible one. The thing just sort of keeps gliding up the coast and trashing it as it moves all the way up to the Boston area. So you've got to think about longer timelines. And the last here is the microgrids. And the key with the microgrids, is they can and should operate with blue sky days and can operate independently when grid disruptions happen. And that's just the MSU model. So I'm going to finish here with my, my pet thing that we started to kind of kick around a little bit here right before COVID hit. So here we are at Northeastern. We certainly want Northeastern as a university to be most self-reliant, but we have neighbors as well. We're part of a community. And it turns out the largest concentration of Boston public housing is directly adjacent to us here in Roxbury. So what if we solarize the rooftops of all that public housing? We also train, perhaps partnering with the community college here in Roxbury, folks to service those, to both install and service those as small businesses. And Northeastern off-hooked the excess power. We became, we buy as much of that can be consumed as possible. So you start to see how, hey, under this model, not only are we, making ourselves more self-reliant, and you've able to see here, we're also reaching out to our most vulnerable neighbors and then figure. So who wins on that, right? The Boston Housing Authority no longer has expensive electric costs. And even after the grid goes down, the most vulnerable population's got power. And Northeast got access to cleaner power. There's a lot of complexity with that, all right? It turns out, lots of complexity, because as soon as you go beyond our footprint, now we run into regulatory issues with the power company saying you're actually, using our distribution system to sell and who's going to pay and offset and so forth here. And this becomes a jurisdictional challenge. Building resilience has lots of challenges with it. And we roughly put them in the boxes of, we're not resilient because we're often risk illiterate. And when I'm talking about risk illiterate, it's not just that we don't understand things like hurricanes and earthquakes. Most of us get some of that. We don't understand how it will impact things that we value. So we really have to map and model that out. Okay, we've got to get smarter about these are hazards, but how will they impact things that we value in our own neighborhoods, in our own communities, or for our universities, or for the systems where a company we rely on. Okay, now we have that understanding. Next, we have to design for resilience. Design for resilience is not just, again, about kind of prepare for things, but things should be able to fail gracefully and have an ability to regenerate and recover stronger and better. That's a much different engineering mindset than one that learns from the past, adds a safety factor, and hopes that things keep running okay going in the future. All right, now you get designs, and nobody's going to adopt them if there's no economic incentive for them to adopt them. These would be cool little pet projects. So that starts to get into regulations, things like insurance and others that have to come and say, hey, this is really going to drive down costs. We want to reward people who do good behavior. And then we're not organized for this. We get jurisdictional nightmare around this stuff. And so you have to think about, okay, how do I overcome those sets of issues? And then we need a generation of folks who think differently, have learned differently, so they're out of their compartments. And that's what we're trying to do at Northeastern. And so at the Global Resilience Institute, we basically identified these as key buckets. So we want our engineers and scientists to help us understand risk and its impact on things that are valuable and vulnerable. Come with the best design, so our School of Architecture, Urban Design, Planning, and so forth here, tackle those issues. Okay, economics and business school can help us think about incentives and how we align all this here. Public policy gets in the mix about jurisdictions, and hopefully we're doing a better job in education. So that's why I'm thrilled to be with all of you today to help with that last piece, and then you'll teach us how to get these kinds of challenges solved. Thanks so much.
Anybody have any quick questions for Steve? We'll have more questions, right? The specific that you have a question on he was working on? All right, we'll save that for later. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, sure.
I'll introduce Maria Cimilluca. She's the Vice President for Facilities here at Northeastern.
Yeah, and is my presentation?
I think it's next.
All right. Great. Okay. Good evening. So my presentation is going to take us on a journey, and it's actually going to pull together the information from the first presentation, and then talk a little bit about the work that Steve just presented on, and in making sure that we understand here at Northeastern what risk factors are going to affect our infrastructure and our grid and our power systems. And so you can't design a system that's going to withstand those risks if you don't understand what they are. And so we did a bit of a climate vulnerability risk, not only for the Boston campus, but for the entire global network. And here on campus, we have about 7 million gross square feet, over 75 buildings. And being within the Back Bay area of Boston, our biggest threats to campus and our infrastructure are sea level rise, extreme storms, and the precipitation from those storms, and extreme temperatures. And you hear a lot about heat islanding. And what happens when temperatures rise is there's increased demand for cooling and a demand on our electrical systems. And so we need to make sure that whatever plans we put in place, we're forecasting future needs against the electrical grid. And so we had a consultant come on board to help us understand what's happening. The city of Boston has done a climate assessment, and we used a lot of the information out of the climate assessment to understand what's going to happen with Northeastern. And you can see we've blackened out where we are here on campus. So as we think about, a 50-year storm, a 75-year storm, on top of a sea level rise of, maybe 2070, what will the impacts be to the city of Boston and to our campus? And this map is illustrative of some of the challenges that the city will face. And it is right along the lines of what Steve presented, right? So transportation will certainly be impacted. The electrical grid will certainly be impacted. And some of the ability for us to potentially island and think about how we will manage our infrastructure through a system like that is really important. So we want to make sure that we understand what will happen with the MTA and public transportation. We want to understand what will happen within the lower levels of our buildings and how we would manage water infiltration. How will the city of Boston respond to such an emergency? And what is our role in the response within that emergency? And we need to really understand what's going to happen to water, sanitation, which will be a huge issue, as well as electrical infrastructure. And I talked a little bit about heat islanding, and this is as an example of some of our buildings and where we'll see most extreme heats, and some of the things that we're doing to make sure that we're mitigating that on campus. So as you walk across the campus, Certainly, we're an arboretum, so we work really hard to make sure that we have a lot of plants, trees, lawn areas. We're putting together architecture standards. So we'll be implementing green roofs on our campuses, which will help. And most of our roof replacements are with white reflective roofs as well. And those steps and really thinking through the design of how we manage not only the landscape, but the built environment will help with offsetting extreme heat within our campus community. And we're not only just looking at Boston, but we're also making sure that we're looking at the global university system. It's important as the facilities manager to make sure that I'm understanding what's happening on every single campus and understanding the impacts to those campuses by any sort of event. Nahant is high because, again, it's right on the coast. Sea rise and extreme storms could impact that campus pretty significantly. Our campuses at Burlington, Denham, in Portland are low impact, but San Francisco and San Jose and our California campuses have multiple threats. Not only are they challenged with now extreme drought, fires and earthquakes are real challenges there. So it's important for us to understand what is the infrastructure there, what type of space are we occupying, and how are we going to make sure that we're mitigating any impact to the campus in those locations. And then Seattle, Charlotte, Toronto, Vancouver, and London are all low impact areas. And the reason that it's important for us to understand the impact of the Boston campus around sea level rise and the storms and heat and other risks is we're in the process of understanding our infrastructure, our electric steam distribution for heat and hot water to campus, and our electric distribution to campus. We have, in last week, Joe Lally presented and talked a lot about energy and what's happening with energy. What we're finding is that a lot of our systems on campus are at the end of their life and we have to replace them. And so we could go back and, like Steve said, a lot of places just replacing kind. You know, the egg falls off the wall, you assemble it all back together, you set it back up. What we want to do is take advantage of this unique opportunity and time to really rethink and to innovate around how we're managing the Boston's campus infrastructure so that, one, we can mitigate all of these risks, but we also, at the same time, want to make sure that we're being good citizens and we're looking at energy justice and how we're managing the energy on campus and our impact of that energy use to our neighbors and our neighboring communities. We also want to make sure that we're thinking about how the steam distribution and will we continue to use steam, or is that old technology? It uses a lot of fossil fuels to generate steam and to power the heat. Do we need to think about electrification? And what would that mean to our campus infrastructure? And how will we modify our buildings, our power plant, and our systems to do that? And does the local utility have enough power to even provide us if we did pivot to an electrification model? These are all really challenging questions for us as we think about how we're going to address and manage the campus infrastructure going forward. The other thing that we are looking at is this notion of, in the right areas of campus, we do need N+1. So that is, you know, providing the right power to the building. And then the +1 is being able to have emergency backup power that supplies that original source of power. We are also modeling load shedding. So what uses and what buildings on campus wouldn't require as much power during a major outage, so that we balance the portfolio properly, so that we are designing for the right infrastructure. So our plans currently, and we've been in design for just about a year, is to think about the campus as a new system. So as we think about a microgrid, so we're designing a microgrid for the campus. And it'll be a little bit different than some microgrids. So we are going to have battery backup storage for the switch over. So when the main feeders to the campus go down, we'll have battery storage to carry the load until we can transfer over to backup generation. And the backup generation will be established at satellite locations around the campus. We had talked about doing a co-generation plant. So actually having a plant that had turbines, and we would generate our own electricity at a capacity where we could drop off the grid completely an island. And the reason that we, two reasons that we are rethinking that model. One is emissions. So as we would build a plant that does something like that, the emissions for the running of those turbines would go right into the neighborhood of Roxbury. And that would not make us very good partners for the local community and for where we have the largest population of housing for the neighborhood. So we're really rethinking what is it and how do we want to make sure that we're providing that resiliency. Solar power is going to be included, and so we will be putting solar power on a lot of our roof tops. Many of our roofs, though, are shaded by low buildings. New buildings are causing shading, and we couldn't get a lot of power. So we're going to be doing a power purchase agreement we're hoping within the city of Boston. So going back to what Steve was saying, is there a way that we can partner with perhaps the local housing authority so that we can put solar on roofs in the neighborhood? Or can we partner with Roxbury community colleges or other entities that have large parking lots and use their parking lots for solar canopy or solar arrays? The other thing that we're exploring as part of this is energy savings initiatives. And so we want to make our buildings smart buildings, putting in the technology and utilizing artificial intelligence, as well as building control sensors, so that we can continue to draw down on the amount of power that we need and that is required to operate campus. And what's interesting about that is that we feel that that's a huge opportunity for us to build on the notion of creating a living learning laboratory. So if you live on a campus that's a microgrid with a smart building technology, that you can go in and host competitions online for energy savings, where you can model how are buildings using energy in your systems and in your engineering classes. As we think about policy and public policy and how maybe the law school can help and assist us with, I have the microphone, sorry, with policy and thinking about the future of energy. Steve referred to some of the really complexities around just being able to establish a microgrid. It is actually quite complex. If we generated our own power, we would not be able to, sell it across the property boundaries because there's so many regulations and different tariffs in place around power distribution. And so it is really challenging for us to think about how could we be strategic in our relationships in our power distribution systems with, let's say, Wentworth, who is our neighbor. Could we go in together on developing a microgrid and doing a cogeneration plant that would provide power to both campuses. Currently, regulations disallow that. We can't do those types of creative and innovative partnerships, which is actually quite discouraging. So we're trying to think of different ways that we're able to continue to have impact while being able to manage our campus. So again, how do we make sure that we're doing and being thoughtful in our design by continue to reduce carbon, making sure that we're providing the right resiliency for the demands and impacts that are facing campus with sea rise and the increased temperatures. And how do we do that in a way that we don't impact our neighbors? And how do we do it in a way that keeps our community secure during a wind outage? And so those are all factors that continue to make sure that we're thinking about as we build and design the grid and our energy system for campus.
Very much, Maria. Thank you. Questions, thoughts? Let's read some information about what we're planning around energy. Anything surprising or interesting that came out of that? All right, so I think like we did last week, I think it's helpful just to have little breakouts to talk about today's presentation. The topic thinking about what would resilience mean to your community? A community can be, where you grew up, where you're living now, a place that you go to often, but thinking about how that community is vulnerable, how that maybe they've taken some actions, and kind of steps we can start thinking about kind of educating our community around resilience. So group yourself into the groups of 3 to 5. Just introduce yourselves if you haven't already, and we can start just kind of get that conversation going, thinking about what resilience means to your community, and if you have had any shocks and experiences to this, and how you kind of bounce back from that. All right, and everybody on Zoom, if you want to stay around, have any questions, we'll be here. We can answer those going forward. All right.
And we'll plan after you do your group work here is have everybody report out on your resilience. Okay, how we're gonna make more resilient communities. All right.
All right. Thanks.
So we'll go.
So go ahead. So good.
About 20 minutes.
10 minutes. 10 minutes.
Oh, 10 minutes. Okay.
Yeah.
10 minutes. Yeah. All right. 10 minutes. Come together. Create a hypothetical community or leverage one yourself. Okay. And say, all right, what should be done to make it more resilient? And then we'll have you all present. Yes.
All right. You guys want to circle back?
All right.
So we got 3 groups. All right, and we got the group online. Do you want to? Somebody online want to report back what you guys were discussing about? Oh, they're not back yet. All right. Well, then we'll leave them for a second. Who would? You guys are up front. Sorry, you have to go first. What did you talk about?
We were talking about like how the resiliency piece would be different in like the areas where or like the areas that you, I guess. And I was talking about like how really having for like island communities like our years.
Sure.
Because like I know about the Hurricane Bob and they were out of power for like a couple of days. And like that is really catastrophic for them, for them because like obviously they're so far from the mainland. And then to get a good example from this community.
Yeah, so I live in California.
Sure.
Fire prone area.
Oh.
And every year in August when the fires come through, the firefighters who are already working out of state and all over the like Central Valley and everything have to come back and expend resources to rush to fill in these fire breaks or like create multiple layers of fire breaks throughout like around the whole town. And if they don't, it sucks for everybody. And I was like every year I'm surprised because they don't engage anybody in the community. They don't ask for like they don't pre-plan. Yeah. It's almost as if they're rushing to kind of create these resiliency measures as the disaster is happening.
Yes.
And it doesn't make sense to me because everybody in my town wants to keep their house. Everybody, or a lot of people will be having to contribute to these efforts to kind of make sure that the fires don't reach the town. So I think there's just kind of a flow.
So they only, for the folks online, we're talking about these communities in California about fires. So they only come when there's a fire nearby to put the fire breaks in. They're not coming in beforehand.
Pretty much, it's not like a yearly thing. It's just we had a really bad lightning storm last year and a fire. Part of the outskirts of town and almost got the down, and they were just trying to rush it to put 3 fire breaks, and that's not something that's regularly.
There's one thing that I spend a lot of time talking to emergency responders, firefighters, police, and so forth here. And a little thing I try to get their attention. I come in and say, "It's so good talking with all you. Have this chance to talk with all you second responders today." You can almost hear this growl come at me here. And basically it's to say the real first responder is a bystander, a family member, a neighbor. Right? That's where often the professionals are the cavalry that comes in and brings some expertise. And I push for you need to democratize, right? You've got to get everybody engaged. You've got to get the community engaged about these hazards. But there's almost it's a professional, almost pride issue. I get trained to do this, and a bunch of volunteers, and what do they know about all this stuff? So you have to break down some of these barriers. And my push to them is there's never enough of you guys to go around on any major disaster. So you've got to figure out how to use the community. And it sounds like, there's certainly good work that could be done, right? And in your communities here along those lines. Everybody now gets the hazard issue and the risk of the impact. So they want to help. But if the systems aren't in place for those volunteers to come in, then, people are just going to sit on the sidelines. Great stuff.
Online, anybody online want to volunteer? Are you talking about? All right, we'll come back. What did you guys discuss?
All right. So I basically discussed. Well, me, I'm from Sosua, the Dominican Republic. It's like a small town with 45,000 people. The Dominican Republic being like a third world country, really they don't really have anything in place because also the government's very corrupt. So we get earthquakes. We're the neighbors to Haiti. In the past like 10 years, we've had some devastating earthquakes. That was also caused public. We've had hurricanes like Hurricane Laura, Hurricane Matthew, Irma, Gustav. That these hurricanes, they cause rivers to flood, and essentially what happens is that a lot of communities are built next to the rivers, and when the rivers flood, it essentially just wipes out houses and everything. Most of the houses built there are like with zinc roofs, kind of like dirt roads. There's a lot of power outages. Like you could go to like a little market and they say, "Oh, we don't have light right now." So like having all these like kind of like you in the United States, like these things are very common to have, and like when they go out, like it's very unpredictable to like see when these things will stop functioning. But in the Dominican Republic, like it's super common. Even in my house, like we have like no light for like 4 days.
Wow.
Yeah.
So when you do have disruptions, it's not disrupting.
Well,
when they're minor, when they're smaller.
Yeah, we do have a generator, but it doesn't really last long. But like it's like the smaller communities, people are like living very much like day by day. And the government hasn't really done anything to like pave these roads or like set up like proper like living areas. People sort of just find where they can build and they settle.
Yeah.
Like the outskirts. But the big city also has a lot of issues. But yeah, it's more about like corruption there. Like even if you wanted to change it, like the foundation of everything is like broken in its own way.
Mm. When I work in the developing world, we find often on more individual or small ways, there's a tremendous amount of self-reliance in part because you can't count on, having power or access to all the things, on life in a way that most American, especially suburban America, is like totally incapacitated. I mean, they don't, put a light switch, this won't go on. What do I do now? I mean, yeah. I mean, it's just because they just don't have the skill set. It comes to find rural Americans and actually urban Americans. There's enough disruption in most urban areas that you have to find your way. But in any event, there's some best practices because some of the things for resilience really are more simple, straightforward. Self-reliance, by time you work around, and we can learn these more from those of us who have figured this out in the developing world. And then we often have in the more advanced world, we often want to come up with very high-tech solutions, but sometimes the solutions can be very low-tech, and you get to the same place. Our initiative that we're also working in the Caribbean is actually trying to bring together the universities and colleges across the Caribbean to work together on developing these resilient solutions. And it's something we're actually working right now with the U.S. Agency for International Development for some support. But the goal is to try to build their capacity. Too often in the developing world, we fly experts in and say, this is what you should do. And, one is everything has a context. So when you come in and try to tell them what to do, it probably won't work. When you go away, most people are like scratching their head. What's that all about? So what you really actually want to do is listen and learn and build the capacity internally to actually respond to that. And that's best done by a collaborative approach. So what we're working is trying to pull together, a number of the college universities who are anchors there, in continuity. Politicians come and go, but they tend to be around and figure out how you leverage that so you can start to build these best practices into not just here. Because we're all in this together. There's no, you want to avoid becoming the island of resilience and the sea of fragility. That only will buy you a little bit of time if you're in that island of resilience, because we're all connected. And so we have to think about how we deal with this.
Thank you. Well, the one thing which is just interesting, people have noticed from a lot of the construction going on around campus here, right? And to think about how that's how we're trying to we're being reactive right now to some of the things, but also trying to understand that these systems are just going to how they interact with what we're doing.
Yeah, so right now on campus, and you can see it everywhere, we have a couple of big dig, I call the big digs happening here on campus. Our steam lines are failing in certain areas. And so again, what we're trying to do is, we quickly have to repair those. And so we are making the repairs.
You guys apparently will want heat
and hot water.
Come November, December apparently. So I guess you gotta get that fixed.
Yeah, but again, thinking about how are we going to make these repairs in a way that we're being thoughtful for future state. So if we evolve away from steam and go to a hot water route, are we installing the right pipe? Are we just, putting a Band-Aid on a solution? Are we going to continue to see failures? There's some circumstances we think that are causing the breakdown of the steam system so rapidly across campus over Spear Hall, certainly in the science quad, and so we're trying to study it to better understand what's happening, so that we are being thoughtful with making plans.
So university is probably better positioned to think about, the overall life cycle, of the systems we expect to be around for a while, right? And so you can think about cost-benefit analysis over a longer time run. We find in the private sector that's not often the case. CEOs are living from quarter to quarter. And when you go public infrastructure, there's an old saying, which is, not in my term of office, okay? If this is going to happen and I can survive it without my 2-year or 4-year term, it's somebody else's problem. And so it's very difficult often to get these dialogues going about the long-term adaptation, especially for this infrastructure here, because the timelines and the reward systems for either political politicians or for corporate players are much shorter. And if we have to integrate our systems, together, we obviously want everybody to pull that way. So it comes back to an incentive structure. What we're trying to work on here is, it turns out everybody doesn't build stuff on their own dime, they borrow money. And the cost of capital is a big element of, of whether or not you're going to get a project done or not. So if the folks who are rating your risk are saying, are you building it for the life cycle, and start to change the financing. So now it costs more if you want to do it, just a slipshod way. Okay, you get money, but you don't get much. But the also reverse is true. If you want to innovate and it's not in the building code, banks will not lend you the money. That sounds like a frill, an extra thing. I mean, who's requiring you to do that? And it's like, oh no, this is going to be really important. We got, these brilliant engineers and scientists telling us at Northeastern that we should do this. And it's like, anybody requiring you to do that? If you want to do it on your own dime. We're only going to lend you for what the requirement is for the code. So you start to see the complexity here, right? If you're trying to get change, we're not starting with a fresh sheet of paper. We're starting with existing codes and standards, with finance systems built around those standards, incentive systems built for folks who are looking in the near term, not the long term. And so these are the complexities that start to make, trying to get to what should be a straightforward. We're going to be more resilient. How we actually get there is where we're hoping all your bright minds and talents will apply to themselves. Right. So we got to hear our last group.
Yeah, last one. Where did you guys?
Something that we didn't touch on, but that I'm now internally realizing is I'm from South Florida. So the idea of not having light in your house for a few days makes perfect sense. Everyone's been there. You just go on with your life. I was just walking with a friend of mine the other day, and it was drizzling. They were saying, "Oh my God, it's so wet." And I had this, well, back in my day, I used to walk my dog through a Category 4 hurricane. And this idea that I'm now in an environment where if the power goes out, everyone loses their mind is something that hadn't registered until just now. So I'm over here internally trying to figure out what happens when the lights go out. Because when the lights go out, this kind of tragedy of the commons sets in, where it doesn't matter big picture. What only matters is my self-preservation. Because if what you expect to be there isn't there, then there's no precedent in your mind for what happens next, except for that you need to continue your own survival.
Okay, I'll say, but you can see some of the differences that if you lose power and it's warm out is different than if you lose power in a winter storm and a vulnerable population, no heat, right? And then the pipes burst and now you have no water, right? And that's what happened with the Texas grid failure here, right? Was the biggest problem was not the loss of power, though, it was the loss of water. And the water impacted on hospitals. You need water to operate and in the middle of a pandemic. And so that impact really was because it was so cold and you lost all the water sector here, the disruption and the costs that went with that here. So that's part of the challenge in really thinking about resilience through an all hazard perspective. Because you can have a solution to say, okay, why do people put things in the basement? You know, it's going to flood there. You put them on the roof. Okay, now you get extreme heat and wind. Okay, so in places sometimes give you all those things. Texas is actually famous. They have snow, they have wind, they have hurricanes, and they don't have much earthquake, but they have about every other mayhem they have. And so you can design something for one hazard that's more common in a location, but then have, you know, the other one set in here. And that's real things get tricky because you really get into trade-offs, right? The best solution for one hazard may introduce fragility against another hazard. And so we can't just think about necessarily the natural occurring, you know, ones, and also man-made ones as well. And so, you know, accidents as well as those with malicious intent, and there's trade-offs. The things you do on security, you know, prevent people getting to a building will make it more problematic to leave the building. And so if egress is something you're going to need in an emergency, you're going to thought about that. These were some of the challenges the Twin Towers had when they were attacked the first time back in the 90s. You know, it was always effort to keep control, and it's like, hey, actually got to get all those people out. And that was not well thought through. So very important here is to think, you know, through all these complexities here, and then you got to get to a more optimal solution.
And I want to add on one more point.
Yeah,
please.
So you read where the cost and benefit analysis, and we think about the expected loss, which is probability of like major disaster happening. It's gonna be like very low chance. Even the loss given severity is very high and the risk exposure is really high. Is it gonna be worth to invest the huge amount of money upfront? Because and it's gonna trade off for like using spaces also in order to stay sustainability. I think the why we should do it, especially in campus, is either we'll cultivate the wind. This is like tax. No one wants to pay tax, but if everyone pays taxes, it's the best outcome.
Yes.
And I think to do this in university, we cultivated like our generation's awareness about this issue. I think that would be most valuable. Because the amount of water and energy saved, this is just not going to make a difference compared to the cost.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point, you know, about any of this. There's a cost-benefit analysis you can do. A challenge we find, though, is many of the times the cost-benefit analysis is done in isolation of the dependencies and the consequences to other users, right? So let's take your power company, and you've got a substation that's exposed to flooding. And if you lose that substation, it costs you $20 million to replace it. And the probability of that station being lost is a 100-year event. All right, so it's 1% in any given year, you know, chance it will happen. So you may say, hey, we'll let it break, and we'll fix it if it goes. That's a pretty rational cost-benefit analysis for that power company. But if the users of that substation have economic value equal to $150 million, so you lose that substation and they're disrupted, right? They're going to be very angry, of course. You know, why did that fail? But the challenge is they're not contributing to the utility to actually invest corresponding with their dependency, right? So if it's 150 million total disruption cost, that's what you would think somebody would say, all right, we may want to address this issue. But if you just go to the utility itself, it's a $20 million exposure for them. So now how do you bring in the players who are dependent on it to say, I want to pony up some resources because this is important when everyone wants just low electricity costs and, you know, the rest of it. So that's some of the issues. What I do think, and this is something we've been struggling even with our national laboratories, our top researchers. Well, we can't predict, when we do cost benefit analysis, we have to map these dependencies and independencies because while I can't predict what one shock will be, there will be a shock, and how it cascades across interdependent systems is predictable. And the costs associated with that can be mapped out. But engineers resisted this and go, well, hang on, we have to understand the risk before we actually, you know, do all that hard work here. You know, let's look at a hazard. And then the engineers will go, no, we got to understand the power grid before we actually, you know, look at water and the rest of the consequences. And I've tried to push back and say, map the dependencies and independencies. Do it, all right? And then see how the shock will cascade across them. And is that cost acceptable? If it is, fine. If it's not, think differently about how you approach it. But there's a resistance because we want to sort of, isolate the problem into a hazard, isolate it into a particular sector, but then you lose the real cost. That's why the resilience imperative comes out of our hyperconnectivity, our dependencies and independencies, which we keep adding on. And therefore the risk exposure only grows. And that makes some of the cost benefit tools we've had less useful than they might otherwise be.
And actually, pulling your last point is as Maria was talking about the new energy program, as that works its way through towards approval, we're going to definitely be engaging everybody about that process and looking for partnerships within everywhere to kind of living lab and kind of like really get that living lab going. Because I mean, that's one of our selling points too for this process.
Yeah, and it's not just solving for resiliency; it's solving for carbon, too, right? So, in climate change, how can we minimize our impact of carbon footprint on the environment? How do we be a good global citizen doing that? And so.
Take all your thinking and all your contributions to get this stuff done, all right?
And when the power goes out in Boston, typically we have a good communication plan. So you'll get emails from us that tell you why and how long usually. But.
All right, well, we're out of time. I think there's a few logistical things. Thank you, everybody online for coming. Thank you, guys. So the tour, right? The first tour? Oh, there we go. All right. Probably share that. All right. First tour is next week at the 6th. People at doing the energy plant tour. That we're going to meet out front here in Shillman. We'll send you a reminder for that. Next week we have Julian, Yuija, Ocheng, and Philippe. Sorry for butchering those names. Presenting. Our topic will be climate justice. And then thanks for your feedback on your reflections. Please, don't think of it as a test, but just a way to kind of think about these discussions and your reactions. I think some of you guys were going to get to these things, but how did this conversation help you think differently about this and how Northeastern or other people should kind of approach this? So just kind of think about it that way. So any final questions or thoughts before we get going? All right, you guys know how to get a hold of us. Thank you very much. Everybody have a good night. Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Maria. This is an excellent conversation. Yeah.